Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of World History 1 with Miss King. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the Americas. So, some names you might be familiar with from maybe elementary school: the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas. But before we begin talking about all the achievements, religion, social hierarchy of these different civilizations, first I want to make sure that we are following along in the fill in blank notes that you'll turn in after listening to this recorded lesson. Each are broken in up into a table, which are then broken down perfectly for the slides. So make sure you are following along, and then please don't forget at the bottom there is the achievements and 3 other questions. And then when you finish that, you will turn that in for a grade. Also on Google Classroom, as I just mentioned, this is where you will find the slides and the fill in the blank notes. And when this video is uploaded, it will be posted right here beautifully. There's also the Early Americas reading analysis. You will read 3 short briefs like you did with the Early Middle Ages unit, and then you will complete a Google form just checking your reading comprehension, and that will also be collected for a grade. You'll then have a Early Americas vocabulary activity. This is like all the vocabulary activities from the other units. You will create a PowerPoint. You will define the word, find a picture to represent the word, and then you will, of course, cite your sources. And then finally, you have an Early Americas math activity. This helps you get acquainted with the geography of Mesoamerica. All of this will be due April 12th by 11:59. So although you have your spring break, make sure you're keeping up with your work. And as we advance towards SOLs, we are trying to pack stuff in, so please follow along. This video might be a little bit longer than my early Middle Ages one, but again, like I just mentioned, we're trying to pack a lot of stuff in, and all of this stuff is pretty interesting. We'll talk about astronomy, we'll talk about ancient ball games, so any like football players, baseball, basketball players. This might be interesting because we talk about one of the first sports, really. So, without further ado, let's begin. Again, make sure you're following along in the fill in blank notes. So, beginning with the Mayan civilization. The Mayan are located in the Mexican and Central American rainforest, more particularly in the Yucatan Peninsula. The Maya see their golden age around 250 AD. So, we talk about golden ages across many different areas throughout world history 1, and the Maya is no exception. Their golden age is also known as the classic period, and this began with city-states flourishing around this Yucatan peninsula. And to get a better idea of where the Yucatan peninsula is, it is this red highlighted portion here. And to see it in another format, we see the United States, so this would be Florida, the Gulf of Mexico. It hangs out right here. Moving right along, their main city is Chichen Itza, so a sort of capital, if you will. And look at these stairs that I can barely climb 2 flights to get into my apartment, let alone climb these stairs to get to a temple atop these pyramid-like structures. Also, thinking about the resources and the labor it took to build these is quite incredible, understanding that they didn't have machinery to help them lift things. They really had to figure out innovative ways through their own physical labor. Their government is made up of groups of city-states like we talked about. They flourished around the Yucatan Peninsula, and these city-states are ruled by a king. So looking at the social hierarchy, each Maya city had its own ruler who was usually a male, but occasionally women governed on their own or in the name of young sons. Nobles served many functions in support of the ruler, such as military leaders, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, managing public works, or being scribes, painters, or sculptors. And the merchants may have formed a middle class in society, But the majority of Mayas were farmers, which we'll talk about in their economics. But before getting to that, here's another picture of their social hierarchy. So, what does this remind you of? What other social hierarchy looked very similar to this? If you're thinking the early Middle Ages, you would be right. So, the early Middle Ages, much like the Maya, had this system. Instead of a king being at the top, it was instead the supreme rules, emperors at the time. So, very much like the kings of early Middle Ages. And then they had their priests and the nobles, merchants and artisans, and peasants and slaves. Going back to the Maya economy, they had farming and trading as their main source of income. Trading, especially being on a peninsula, which we know is a peninsula is a surface of area surrounded by three sides of water. And farming, they found a lot of success in farming being around a peninsula, but they had to come up with some innovative methods of farming for when it flooded. They grew beans, maize, which is corn, but we're going to call it maize, squash, fruit trees, cotton, and tropical flowers. Thinking about where they're located, again, going to the Yucatan Peninsula, we see Cuba and we see Florida. So those aren't desert areas, those are very tropical areas. So we can imagine that the Maya civilization was very tropic itself. So we see things like tropical flowers and fruit trees. But like I was mentioning earlier, the two ways they learned to farm were through burning down trees in order to produce fertile land and clear it in order to have that land to farm on, or they would build raised fields to lift crops above the annual floodwaters. These methods allowed the Maya to produce enough maize and their other crops to support rapidly growing cities. Their religion, like all three of these civilizations, the Maya, Inca, and Aztecs, were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. In a minute, when we talk about the first sort of ball game, we'll watch a video that talks about some of these gods. Being that they are polytheistic and believe in many gods, they often build sacred pyramids, which we see here, and they are usually topped at with a temple, and these temples served as burial grounds, places for rituals or ceremonies. But for the end of the Maya civilization, we see that around 900 AD, the Maya began to abandon many of their cities. And by the time the Spanish arrived, the Maya were mostly in farming villages. Frequent warfare may have taken its toll on society, and overpopulation could have led to overfarming and just exhaustion of the soil from burning down trees and the soil going infertile. But today, more than 2 million Maya people live in Guatemala and southern Mexico. So that's pretty impressive. As we move through these pictures, some of the things we'll talk about are like astronomy and mathematics. This is an observatory. So priests needed to measure time accurately in order to produce an accurate calendar for different religious rituals and ceremonies. So they used the stars and constellations in order to create a calendar. And as we talked about in the social hierarchy, the scribes who found their place amongst the nobles, they would often write on these large stone slabs, and they would mention names of rulers. So this might be a ruler of a certain time period. So as we see from the bottom, it says Stella 51 from Calakmul, and it's dating to 731. This is the best preserved monument in that particular city. But it's pretty impressive that they took the time to scribe these out. It wasn't like sharpening your pencil and putting it on a piece of paper. You had to use stone and rocks to kind of carve your way. These also kind of go back to the temples we were just talking about here. They would perform those rites and sacrifices, and often you would see things like their prized possessions around these temples. We'll talk about that more with the Aztecs. But again, this is the observatory, and knowing that this is important for the development of astronomy and mathematics. The Maya invented a counting system based on three symbols instead of numbers. The symbols were a dot to represent a 1, a bar for a 5, and a shell for a 0. But getting over to, I know what you are all waiting for, sitting at the edge of your seats, anticipating, is the ball game. So without further ado, we are going to watch a quick video which talks about the Mayan legend which inspired this ball game. And then we'll move on to the infamous Aztecs.
For the Maya, the sky was not the only otherworldly domain. And the gods of the sky were not the only ones that had to be appeased. Beneath the earth, there lay another vast realm, a supernatural underworld where the spirits of the dead roamed.
For the Mayas, the structure of the world. We are living in the living plane, that it's the earth, and then there's the skies with different levels, and of course the underworld. The underworld was the place where the people that are not living anymore are there. So for them, when you die, it's not the end of everything.
In the Popol Vuh, an ancient Mayan narrative, the underworld is called Xibalba, the place of fear. It has 9 perilous levels, ruled by 12 lords, gods of death, who are responsible for disease and affliction. The Maya believe this place of death exists side by side with the land of the living. The underworld could be reached in the most unlikely of places. This huge open court in Chichen Itza looks almost like a marketplace, but no buying or selling went on here. It was the setting for an ancient Mayan ball game, a game far deadlier than any modern sport. Measuring 550 by 230 feet, the court is over twice the size of a modern American football field. Here, 2 teams faced off, with players aiming to hit the ball through hoops high on the walls. They play for the highest possible stakes, because the losing team faces being sacrificed to the gods. The winners kill the losers and cut off their heads. Wall reliefs show the victors holding a loser's severed head. At first glance, the high walls that surround the ball court don't seem to have much purpose. The reason for their existence could lie in the game's religious meaning. An ancient myth from the Popol Vuh explains its origins. In this story, heroic twins play the game with the lords of the underworld. The lords dismember them and burn their remains. The twins are reborn. Emerging from the underworld, they become the sun and the moon.
They die and they revive again every day to remind humans that they got to keep the balance, maybe by making offerings and rituals specifically to the underworld.
So I don't know if we would want to play our sports like the Mayans played theirs, ending in death. But it is interesting to see that games like this were even still used, as a way of entertainment in some sense, but also as a way to give religious offerings. Again, this shows the high walls, and it shows almost the beginning of the sun god and the moon god, I would imagine, seeing as the video mentioned, it is to hold this sort of balance. Sorry for flipping through the slides there. I was looking for myself. But it keeps this sort of balance, and it reminded the Mayan people still of their religion and of their gods. And the last little tidbit I'll include about the Mayans, since we're talking about religion, is that when we talk about things like spirit animals, we're kind of referring to the complex polytheistic religion that these civilizations held. And the Mayan especially believed that a person had was associated with a particular animal, which we today call our spirit animal. So, moving right on into the Aztecs, around 1200 AD, if you can take yourself there, a band of nomadic people, so traveling all over, remember, from the north migrated into the Valley of Mexico. So, when we are looking at that on a map, that would obviously be the Valley of Mexico. It's not going to be in South America. It'll still be in Mexico in this blue spot. Going back to the Mayan real quick, here's a picture of some Mayan farming. We'll talk about this with the Aztecs too, just raising their farming beds, but I wanted to show that picture. I believe it's in these slides, but just really interesting. And as we talk about the Aztecs and their economics, we'll talk about this farming. But again, they were in the arid, desert-like valley of central Mexico. Their main city was Tenochtitlan. Their government was ruled by an emperor. And as we talked about, their economics was farming and tributes from conquered enemies. So we'll talk about human sacrifices. But their floating gardens, which are also portrayed here, so I didn't need to switch over. Their floating gardens, called chinampas, were kind of artificial islands made of mud piled atop of reed maps. And they were anchored to a shallow lake bed, and they would float. And here they would grow maize, again, corn, squash, and beans. This is the Great Temple we'll talk about as we talk about more achievements. But again, with their social hierarchy, they had fierce conquests and shrewd alliances. By 1517, the Aztec Empire actually numbered an estimated 5 to 6 million people. But like the Maya, the Aztecs had a clear social hierarchy. So, like we said, ruled by an emperor. They had a council of nobles, priests, and military leaders who elected the emperor and whose primary function was to lead in war. Again, they are a conquest civilization. Below the emperor, the nobles served as officials, judges, and governors of the conquered provinces. And then next came the warriors who could rise to noble status by performing well on the battlefield, really impressing. And then the priests were a class apart. They performed rituals to please the gods and prevent droughts or other disasters. So they were kind of like the got you man of the civilization, if that makes sense. Like, I got you, man. While y'all are gardening in the river and are leading officials and judges, the priest is going to make sure that the gods are satisfied, often through human sacrifice. The Aztecs had a powerful middle class, and they had long distance traders. They had goods from the highlands like weapons, tools, ropes, and jaguar skins and cocoa beans, which is kind of insane. But the majority of Aztec people were commoners who farmed the land. And at the bottom of the society, a word you might be familiar with, were serfs and slaves. These were often prisoners of war or debtors. But the slaves' rights were clearly established by law. For example, slaves could own land and buy their own freedom. Religion and mythology, the Aztecs, like all three civilizations we are talking about, are polytheistic. They believe in many gods. And like the Mayas, they had sacred pyramids and did human sacrificing. Other info is that they were vicious warriors. They were later conquered by Hernan Cortez, and Tenochtitlan, actually, the remains are under Mexico City today. Some other just side facts about the Aztec civilization is that they were also keepers of knowledge, much like the Mayans. Priests were the keepers of all Aztec information. They recorded laws and historical events. Some priests ran schools, and others used their knowledge of astronomy and mathematics to foretell the future. So again, they are class apart on this social hierarchy from the emperor or the nobles. They are powerful in their own sense. The Aztecs have two calendars. They have a 260-day ritual calendar based on the movements of the sun. And this is used to schedule the best days to build houses and conduct ceremonies. You don't want to conduct a ceremony on a rainy day. And then we have the 365-day calendar, which we still have today. And that was based on the movement of the constellation Pleiades. And it helped the Aztec civilization plant and harvest crops. So, and knowing that much of any civilization is based on agriculture, seeing the success of this 365-day calendar on Aztec crops and civilization, we can see why maybe we transferred that into some of our other methods of agriculture, and we have a 365-day calendar today. Other achievements such as mathematics, the Aztec use a numbering system based on 20. The use of symbols to write numbers, and other symbols such as arrows, hearts, and hands to stand for fractions. And illness was a punishment from the gods. So if you got sick, it's your fault. Must have been you deserve it for something. The gods are punishing you. But the Aztecs used herbs and other medicines to treat fevers and wounds. And interesting enough, Aztec physicians could set broken bones and treat dental cavities. Who would have thought? Dental cavities, of all things. So, thinking about some of our human sacrificing, here is a picture of that. But again, we talked about them being conquered by Hernan Cortez. At the height of Aztec power, the word reached Tenochtitlan that pale-skinned, bearded men had landed on the East Coast. And the Spanish had already found allies among peoples who were ruled by the Aztec Empire, so they easily were able to move in and conquer much of the land. And finally, with the Incan civilization, last but certainly not least, the most powerful of the Andean civilizations, the Inca civilization, emerging around 1100. So a little bit later, we do these in order. I hope you were able to tell we went from Maya to the Aztecs. Again, the Maya had their golden age in 250 AD. Then we see the Aztecs emerge. And then finally, the Incas around 1100. And another thing you might be familiar with or have heard of before, Machu Picchu. We will take a look at that. But first, let's look at where the Andes Mountains might be of Western South America. So on this map, where do you think the Andes Mountains and Western South America would be? If you're thinking that's easy, it's the green highlighted portion. Well, look at you. You're great with maps. And it is. This is where the Incan civilization formed. And as you can see, being the most powerful is because look at all this. They were trading and they were moving right along the coast. They have all that land to themselves. So in 1438, a skilled warrior and leader proclaimed himself Sapa Inca, the emperor. So their government, oh, this is the Aztec, is ruled by an emperor. Small kingdoms at Cusco in a high mountain valley. He set out on a campaign. So again, we're looking at conquest, we're looking at warfare. And then once he subdued neighboring peoples, he enlisted them in his armies. And his son continued the expansion with Cusco at the capital. And the empire, which remember what we were talking about, how big it is, the empire stretched more than 2,500 miles along the Andes, from Ecuador in the north to Chile in the south. I don't know about you guys, but the most I've ever driven in a road trip myself is about 500 miles, and I thought I was going crazy. So think about 2,500 miles of land, especially at this time. So the Sapa Inca, who we're talking about, the emperor, held absolute power, claiming to be divine, the son of the sun itself. Gold served as the emperor's symbol, and this is because it was like the sweat of the sun. His queen was known as the Koya, and she carried out important religious duties and sometimes governed in his absence. He laid claim over all the land, herds, mines, and peoples of his empire. The Inca people had no personal property, and there was little demand for items for barter or sale. Trade played a much smaller role in the Inca economy than it had in the earlier Maya economy. And again, with all this land, it might be hard for trading, but as we'll see, they developed a massive road system. But staying with government for now, the Inca rulers ran an efficient government. And then again, nobles ruled the provinces along with local chieftains. Below these rulers, we have the officials who carried out day to day business, enforcing laws, and organizing labor, so much like the others. But something specific we'll talk about with the Incas is this tool called the quipu. And specifically, trained officials kept records on quipu, a collection of colored strings. So these would all be different colored that were knotted in different ways to represent various number values. So instead of doing symbols like the other two, the Aztecs and the Mayas, the Incas used quipu. And these are these knotted ropes you see here. The Inca never invented a writing system, but they used the quipus to record economic, bureaucratic, religious, and other information. So that's a pretty interesting and innovative way to come up with a form of communication as far as keeping record. Like I talked about, the Inca created one of the history's greatest road networks. At its greatest extent, it was about 14,000 miles through mountains and deserts. So, oh, this is farming. Let's see. This is maybe one of their roads in the mountains. I will have to find a better picture, but as you see, they created these civilizations on the side of mountains. And with no other help than physical labor and llamas. So it's pretty insane. I will have to find another picture to upload of their road system because I could not imagine driving on the side of a mountain like that. The closest thing I think you could get to that is maybe like going towards West Virginia around here. But the roads allowed armies and news to move rapidly throughout the empire. They would have relays of runners who could carry news of a revolt swiftly from a distant province to the capital. And then they also had hundreds of bridges that spanned rivers and gorges. And like we see here, steps were cut into steep slopes and tunnels were actually dug. So this might be a tunnel here. It could just be, it looks like people might be touring. So it could be like a visitor center, but they would create these tunnels in the side of the mountain. Ordinary people, however, were restricted from using the roads at all. So again, we didn't see much flourishing trade. People, commoners like farmers, what have you, not really allowed on the road. So Cusco as its capital, their main city is Machu Picchu, but talking about Cusco as the capital early on, all the roads would lead through here. In the heart of the city stood the Temple of the Sun. And here you found interior walls lined with gold, enormous stone blocks that fit exactly into place. So they didn't need any other tools like screws. This is Machu Picchu here, by the way. It's pretty insane. Thinking that people lived here or did their regular day-to-day life here. Of course, it's much different than we could ever imagine today. They weren't getting in cars and driving to work. They were waking up with the sun, maybe doing some religious ritual ceremonies, farming, taking care of like their sheep, whatever they had for as far as cattle and crops. And for their economics, like we were just talking about, they had high altitude farming, and this led to terrace farming. This is flat strips of land on the steep hillsides and the stone walls to hold the land in place. The terraces kept rains from washing away the soil and made farming possible in places where naturally flat land was scarce. So farmers spent part of each year working land for their community. So, like when we look back at Machu Picchu, they might have been working this land for the entire community, and part of it working land for the emperor and for the temples so that they could provide offerings to the priests, to the emperor, and to the gods. The Incas were actually also masters of metalwork and weaving. They learned how to work and alloy or blend different metals like copper, tin, bronze, silver, and gold. Copper and bronze were used for more useful everyday objects, and then they reserved precious metals for statues of gods and goddesses, the eating utensils for the nobles, so eating off of silver spoons, and decorations. The medical practices, they develop important medical practices such as surgery on the skull. So people who were keeping records through knots, which is kind of genius if we think about it today, were also learning, teaching themselves and advancing medicine as far as surgery on the human skull. They also used anesthesia, ancient anesthesia. I don't know if I would trust that. And then they found ways to mummify the dead. So again, people offered food, clothing, and drink to the guardian spirits of the home and the village. And each month had its own festival. That sounds kind of fun there, though. From the great ripening and the dance of the young maize to the festival of the water. And festivals were celebrated with ceremonies, sports, and games. So maybe the Mayan sport we talked about earlier. And then we see a breakdown of power. So, well, before that, other info, the massive road system, again, Quipo, and then they were conquered by Pizarro, who we'll talk about the breakdown of power of the Incan civilization. At its height, the Inca was a center of learning and political power, especially with close communities like Machu Picchu, and just having massive amounts of land that they could travel and utilize. But in 1525, a civil war broke out over which of the emperor's sons would reign next, and this weakened the empire at the crucial moment of the arrival of Francisco Pizarro. So again, Spanish invaders like the Aztecs with Hernan Cortez, we see that the Spanish also come in and infiltrate the Inca civilization. And with the Spanish, we have to think the Spanish not only brought warfare, but they were from another country. So they often brought a lot of different diseases that these people were not equipped, their immune systems were not equipped to recover from. So many of them died from smallpox, others died in battle. So we see the kind of fall of these civilizations, but we see their legacies in lasting things like astronomy, mathematics, calendars, our year, even. And so we can't forget, especially when we look at any history, no matter how good, bad, or ugly it may seem, it all has roots back to where we are today. Looking at even things like the ball game, the first idea of really sports. So to answer the last bit of your fill in the blank notes, make sure you have the achievements of the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incans, such as the calendars, the mathematics, and the writing systems. So again, remember we talk about with the Mayas, they had these stela or stelae, and they carved their records into huge stone. Although the Inca didn't have a writing system, they had the quipu. Um, and then mathematics, we see the introduction of things like multiplication, division, geometry. They're building these massive pyramids and structures to the point where you have to understand some kind of width, length, height, and diameter, I would imagine. Again, I teach history, I don't teach math for a reason, but it's pretty amazing the things these early American civilizations were able to accomplish and that have leaked over into our lives today. So, as a review, I want you guys right now, even though I can't hear you, I want you guys to remember which highlighted portion goes with which civilization. I will give about like 10 seconds of silence and then I will break the answers. I will cave. So I hope you went back through your notes and were maybe looking and were able to point out that this here on the Yucatan Peninsula is the Mayan civilization where we saw Chichen Itza, we saw the observatories, we went on a nice little trip there. And then we went over to the Aztecs in the arid desert valley of Mexico. Um, and here we saw things like human sacrifice, but we also saw really great things like the Great Temple and cool farming, like in the middle of rivers. And finally, here in South America, we have the Inca civilization. And here we saw the quipu, the recording of numbers using knotted ropes. We also saw terrace farming, where these people were farming on the side of mountains, and the most massive road system of its time period. So we did a lot today. We covered a lot of ground. We journeyed far and wide through the early Americas. Thank you for joining along in this segment. Make sure that you are finishing up your fill in the blank notes and getting those turned in as you finish this video recording. It will be collected for a grade, as is everything that's posted in Google Classroom. So make sure, as you are all enjoying your spring break and soaking up, hopefully, some sun and nice weather and staying healthy, that you are getting your ancient history work done. Until next time, everyone, I hope everyone has a safe and healthy spring break, and I'll talk to you later.